Good morning. This is Dr. Daria Brezinski with Children Come First, WAAT 750 AM on your radio dial. We're here every Tuesday from 10 to 11 a.m. and we welcome you. This morning we have as our guest Carrie Girstantus. Good morning, Carrie.
Good morning, Daria. How are you?
Fine. Carrie is from living in Virginia, and Carrie is a person who works with systems, integrated systems. That's what we're going to be talking about today with regard to children, the curriculum, teaching, and students and the community. Carrie, can you give us a little bit of background in terms of integrated? What do you mean by integration of the different systems?
What I'm making reference to, my background is from really three different areas. I have a background in systems engineering. I also have studied ecology and then education. And for me, when I'm making reference to integrating systems, I'm talking about that on several different levels. So I'm talking about the student as an individual being able to become a more integrated learner, being able to access more of the different ways in which to learn and explore and live in the world. And then when I'm talking about an integrated classroom, we're talking about the opportunity for a student and a teacher and all of the classmates to have an opportunity with the content to create an environment where learning is rich and meaningful, and there's an opportunity for those learning spaces to become like a community.
How is that different from a regular classroom?
Well, I think it's different. I think it happens in some classrooms, and I don't want to. I would really like to support the places where it currently happens. But I think that a lot of teachers are struggling right now with needing to get through a lot of content during the course of their classroom and the way that classes are scheduled, that they struggle a lot to create a meaningful learning experience for all of their students, and to really be able to engage their students in that process of creating the kind of learning that's taking place in the classroom.
Now, you talk about the dynamics of the student, the teacher, and the content as being one and whole. How is what you're talking about differ from what's happening in the classroom today?
Again, I think that it's really difficult to compare what's going on in lots of different kinds of classrooms. I think that different regions of the country, as well as different kinds of classrooms, whether they're in a public setting or a private setting, or some of the alternative programs that currently exist within the public sector as well, I think that they all are struggling with different kinds of issues. But I think there's definitely a pervasive concern for the need to get through a lot of content and not enough time, and it being a very overwhelming experience, not just for the student, but also for the teacher and the school as a whole.
What are some of the fundamental elements that guide education today in content and in the learning environment?
Well,
what do you feel should be the fundamental elements?
Yeah, part of the fundamental elements in education is really to be able to, I talk about roots and rights and Renaissance. And what I'm making reference to...
The 3 R's.
3 R's. Is that roots is an opportunity for a student to discover who they are and the things that support them. So that's, their community, the country that they live in, their cultural history, as well as an exploration of the kinds of languages that are part of their own authentic identity. And when I'm talking about rights, I'm talking about the opportunity for students to, be involved in a democratic process of learning where they are clear. There's clear rules, clear boundaries, and there's explicit expectations of all the different roles and dynamics that happen in a classroom. So I see that as both rights as an individual person, but I also see that as the rites of passage, the opportunity to move through your life and understand more clearly your interrelationship to the other people around you. And Renaissance, I'm making reference to all of the different ways we have access to express ourselves through the arts, but also in the way that we have the opportunity to recreate the world around us. So in a very, pure sense, to recreate our environment and the world in which we live. So as to support each other, and again, going back to a real fundamental idea of creating a community of learners, and that learning is a lifelong endeavor that will always be with us.
You talk about brain organization and the dimensions of the focus dimension. What do you mean by that?
What I'm making reference to, so one of the areas of expertise that I have is with educational kinesiology. And that is a integrative tool between the mind and the body. And it's a very simple method in which you can get feedback from your own body, from your own environment, as to what is supporting you in learning and what is not supporting you in learning. And one of the things that I think is not to be underestimated is how frequently a student can be put into a place of fight or flight, just into a real, genuine place of survival. And there's just so many stresses that are impacting a student, but the opportunity really is for there to be, clear and smooth communication between both the neocortex, which is the front region of our brain, and that fight or flight, which is really just our most primal patterns of surviving. And so that there's a real opportunity in creating an environment where a student is engaged in active learning, for there to be more opportunity for the potential of that learner to be expressed in the classroom.
Now you make references to a life-choosing paradigm versus a death-reacting paradigm that we have in schools today.
Correct.
What's that? I mean, that's quite an interesting topic.
What I'm making reference to is that, where I like to focus most of my attention is really into the life-choosing paradigm, which is that of liberation. I think there's a lot of methods that are, I think that a lot of students go through their academic experience very, very stressed, and that is nothing more than just a real base-level survival. And if we're ever going to move into an opportunity for potential for our real, authentic expression of self and community and humanness, that's really going to come when we make concrete choices to live, and to live meaning to be engaged in our environment.
And what is the what is the difference between death reacting? I don't understand.
So when I'm making reference to death reacting, what I'm making reference to is all of the different ways that, anytime that we're just making a reaction to a situation, and we're not making an active choice in that environment, then we are reacting to a situation. And that reaction, at least in my experience, is just that real primal, fear of not being able to make it. So I call that death. And when we are in an opportunity or a position where we are recognizing and honoring the gifts of all the participants and all the children within a classroom, then we are really talking about life, and we're talking about growth, and we then have access to all of the ways in which we can support each other in creating that.
So the death-reacting paradigm is kind of reflects our addictive behaviors, our survival instincts.
Yeah, and I think that a lot of what we have learned about that particular model is through a lot of the people that study addiction issues. So when you've got an addict who's an enabler and a hero and a scapegoat, and lost children. Those names, those titles in that model are really just a way to explicitly recognize a role that was taken on during a time of stress. And I think that we frequently in classrooms, will scapegoat children or scapegoat teachers, or just that there's some of the students that really are like lost children, that we never have the opportunity to really engage them in our learning environment because we're so entrenched in just making it day to day. So I make reference to that as death reactive, because what the focus of that model and that paradigm is not living and growing, but it's just not dying.
Okay. You talk about trauma, recovery from trauma. Do you consider children traumatized in the classroom today, or in life in general, in culture?
What I'm making reference to, one of the areas that I worked for several years was with a child assault prevention program. And the statistics on children that have experienced abuses in lots of different forms is pretty startling. I think the statistics are 1 out of 8 boys and 1 out of 4 girls will have will at some point during their life be in an experience of child abuse or sexual abuse. And so when I make reference to trauma, what I'm really, I'm not presuming that every student has had a traumatic experience. What I am doing is having the process of recovery, which has been very, I think, thoroughly explored and developed as a model for how we can create a more life-supporting learning environment. The other real connection for me is that there's a really prevalent concern with students that struggle with issues of ADD. And the list of symptoms that a student with ADD are actually very similar to those of post-trauma.
What are those symptoms?
In reference to not being able to focus on specific tasks, being overwhelmed by information, not being able to sit still, so a lot of the characteristics that a student with ADD is struggling with is either being unable to focus on the information that's taking place right now, or kind of spacing out and not being able to, so there's 2 extremes to that. And both of those extremes are related to the back brain and the front brain, and that interrelationship between our ability to stay focused in the moment, in the present. And so the fundamental, issue with that is to create a safe environment, and that's just straight across the board. I think that every and so whether it's rooted in, when I make reference to trauma, what I'm really doing is just letting it serve as a way for us to understand what may be happening for some of our students, and allowing the healing process that we know from traumatic stress to serve as a way that we might be able to better create a learning environment that honors all of the children and supports an environment of healing.
Some psychologists suggest that this ADD syndrome we have and the trauma syndrome and all those things are literally created and manufactured out of the fact that we don't allow children the ability to interact and integrate what they're learning in the classroom and move around in the classroom. We've known for the last 50 years that in order for learning to take place, the cognitive, the affective, and the psychomotor domain have to be in place, and yet we know that in classrooms the affective and the psychomotor domain are virtually non-existent unless you're going to a meeting with a psychologist or to gym class. So how do you respond to those people who claim that the correlates that you're talking about with ADD and the symptoms that are caused by these things, in fact, aren't something that are part of a reactionary response to the school culture?
I think you're bringing up a lot of really, that's exactly what I like what you're saying as far as what your question again is. Rephrase the question.
I wanted to know, people say that we are suffering from many psychological maladies of children because of the fact that we don't allow them to move around the classroom and deal with their emotions and their feelings. So these things become bottled up inside. So how would you respond to people who say that to you with regard to your life-supporting paradigm?
Well, I mean, I think that the general nature of the classroom does need to be addressed. And I really feel like one of the greatest things that we can do in a classroom is provide better support for the teachers. I think that the teachers themselves have a tremendous one of the ways that I think that would be incredibly supportive is if teachers were not in classrooms by themselves, that if you had more than one adult, both to model the experience of two adults interacting cooperatively, but also to recognize that there's going to be a wide range of needs that are going to be emerging from the students within the classroom. And, you know, and so I think even the expectation is just set up for an environment where no one's going to get their needs met. You know, the teacher is not going to be able to create a learning environment for every single student all the time. And so I think that we've just created a scenario that's going to it doesn't support any of the players in the system. And so we really do need to be looking at new models of how a classroom could be engaged. And I think that we are talking about a look at changes of schedules, team teaching, and I think a lot of schools already do this and find a lot of success in those kinds of ways of changing the learning environment. And I think that there will be less need to diagnose certain behaviors because I think that they will have an appropriate way to be expressed within a different kind of, classroom structure.
This is Dr. Daria Brezinski at WAAT 750 AM on your radio dial. With Children Come First, we're here every Tuesday from 10 to 11 a.m. And we're here today with Carrie Girstantus, who talks about integrated learning systems in the curriculum and in the school environment. And we were talking about life-supporting and death-reacting paradigms in terms of our student response and our student environments. Now, I wanted to talk to you about, most people have a misconception of what child-centered learning is. What is your definition of child-centered learning?
Well, child-centered learning is just the opportunity for a learning environment where the student is an active participant in both the content and the method that learning is going to proceed or grow or evolve within a classroom setting. So I think that it creates an opportunity for a full learning experience that's going to recognize what the individual student's learning, where they are in terms of their own learning, and then really where their goals are leading them, and so I see that as being a fundamental element of a child-centered learning environment.
Something I was thinking about as you were talking before, you suggested that we have two teachers in a classroom.
Uh-huh.
How would you suggest taxpayers pay for two teachers in a classroom? It's a great theory, but in literal practice, how would we fund that?
Well, I think to move to a situation where you would have more than one adult available to a group of students at a point in time during a class day is really looking at reshaping the whole structure of a learning environment. And I think that we see this most immediately in, a history English classroom combined. There'll be block scheduling, and then two teachers teach the content, and wherever there's interaction between the content, and the two teachers support each other in the learning of that, in the teaching of that. So I think that there are many creative ways, and I think that a lot of there exists a lot of community schools throughout the country that have already employed an opportunity for students to access more than one teacher throughout the course of their day. And so I think a lot of those questions will be derived from, a lot of the answers to those questions are going to come from the goals and the needs of the specific learning institution we're working with. What age group are we working with? And so I don't, the question isn't really, I don't think that the number of teachers is necessarily going to change dramatically in creating that kind of structure. I think you'll just have teachers taking on a different kind of role versus being a voice piece for content as really a facilitator for the learning experience of the people, the students that are in their classroom.
Well, it's interesting because I just got off the phone today with a university head of Department of Education today, who is reiterating to me something that many colleges and universities are saying to me, not only colleges and universities, but public schools around the country, and that there are not enough teachers for classrooms today. Less and less students are becoming educators and professionals going on to have administrative degrees, and we have a shortage of not only teachers but principals and administrators as well. So we're looking at a critical crisis here in education in terms of the role models that we're talking about. How would we restructure the classroom, for example, in the advent of all this shortage of teachers? What do you have any suggestions for us with regard to that?
I think that I think again, if we look at the true role of a teacher as a facilitator of learning for the students in their classroom, I think that we will be looking at a different kind of profession as a teacher. I think our teacher education programs are going to. A teacher will no longer necessarily be specialized in a specific I think there will always be teachers that will be specialized in different content, but I think there'll be far more availability to lots of different kinds of members of the community for participating within the school structure and the learning experience of their students. I think that that's part of what we're leaving out a lot of really fundamental players in a student's learning experience by placing all of the, focus on these teachers to be able to move through all of this content and achieve these standards and criteria. And I think that if we can take a step back and really, think of education as the learning process for a student, I think that the role of the teacher will change, and that by the nature of that role changing, I think we're going to have a different kind of person who's going to want to and be available to, be involved in the educational process of a student.
So what you're saying is that we need to look at a model that gives education and learning back to the child as opposed to the teacher preparing all the work and doing all the work and testing the children on the information that he or she has imparted to them, but rather having the students be a much more active role in their learning process and having them take on the responsibility of research and preparation for class through assignments and things like that, rather than having the teacher as the focal point of the classroom.
Absolutely. I think that students are not given the opportunity for real deep kind of thinking, and nor are they supported in that. And I think that that's really going to have to be an important aspect of education. And I think that the problems and the struggles and the issues that we are dealing with as a society and as an international community necessitate having the ability to be able to take a complex set of information and be able to make meaning from it. And I think that that's going to be far more the intent of a learning environment.
The problem I see with this is that initially in the initial stages, when you give, I know this from experience with schools that many schools that have started new kinds of programs, alternative programs, it takes years for children to be able to unlearn the types of learning models that they had in schools. And so what happens is that in the beginning stages, when the responsibility is given back to them, they tend to overreact and act out and use their freedom in inappropriate ways. And so it takes sometimes years for these children to be able to settle down and start the learning process. And I think our listeners need to know that it takes time for children to be able to learn a new way of doing things, learn a new way of learning and thinking, and it's not going to happen overnight for a child-centered curriculum. It happens step by step, and everyone must be retrained, not just the students, but the teachers and the administrators as
Absolutely.
well. Because sometimes what happens is in these classrooms, chaos emerges, and a parent walking past the classroom will find that there's children moving around the classroom and doing things, and then all of a sudden the parent says it doesn't look like learning's happening, and they're having fun and they're asking questions and they're all talking, and often chaos is not reflected as a learning process, but in fact it is. I was thinking of an example of the being in a train station, and when you're in a train station and all of a sudden you're about ready to board your train, and over the announcement comes that your train that you thought was departing at gate A is now going to be departing at gate C. So everyone begins to run towards gate C. It appears like chaos and pandemonium in the beginning, but underlying everything is everyone's focus of getting to gate C, and I think that's the learning model that we have to look at, even though things may look like chaos in the beginning, and chaos has a good part of it.
Well, and I think looking at any healing process, there is that instant where we have to reconcile the discrepancy between what the reality is that we're living in and where it is that we're trying to the vision of where we're trying to go. And I think that for me that isn't necessarily chaos, but also just maybe even tension. It's just aware. And again, I think as we become far more trusting and able to experience the fullness of our life, that experience of things just being different isn't going to be as distressing. It'll be actually part of the process of healing, because we are, like you said, that we are going somewhere. We're not just randomly going about in all different directions.
You are listening to Children Come First. This is Dr. Daria Brezinski on WAAT 750 AM. We're going to take a break for a few minutes. We're here with Carrie Girstantus from Virginia, who's talking about integrated systems of learning. And we will be back after a short, brief message from our sponsors to talk about children, integrated systems, schooling, and the child-centered learning process. So please join us again for our next half hour at Children Come First with Dr. Daria Brezinski, and we'll take a short break.
That even when you provide a very supportive experience for an individual student, that in order for a real change to take place, that you have to have far more of those players involved with it. You can work with a student one-on-one, but if things aren't changing in the classroom that they go back to, or within certain elements of their home, or there's no way for a real shift to occur for that student to take on the responsibility and the interest and the just all the different aspects of learning as it needs to be.
You were talking about co-created learning methods and having children make choices, or I'm not sure if you meant children making choices or teachers making choices in terms of methods of teaching. We've heard so many different things about choice. Choice these days means voucher schools, charter schools. What do you mean by choice in the method of teaching?
I think we're talking about it, again, at different levels of scale. I think choice is something that needs to be very, made available to people, and I think that
People, children, students, who are you talking about?
I'm talking about students, and I'm talking about the teachers, and I'm talking about the families, and what I'm again when we're talking about individual students and children, what we really need to be mindful of is what where they are in their own learning process. Are they a young child? Are they, are they adolescent? Are they getting ready to move into their teenage years? I mean, where is this learner as an individual person in their own growth? And then choices become, shaped and facilitated and supported by the adults within that child environment.
So are you suggesting then that children choose their own coursework?
Not necessarily. I think that as a facilitator, you can, provide that connection to the whole, the context of the learning. A teacher in the role as a facilitator is going to be able to kind of draw the map out and say, these are all the different options and areas. These are the kinds of things that we need to cover. These are the areas. And given where you are now, how would you like to move through this? So even within the very strict structures of needing to come up with meet the criteria of a standards of learning, a teacher is able to create a learning environment where an individual student can make a choice as to the content, or the flow of the content, or the method of the content, or this assignment may be, this exam might be oral and this exam might be, written.
So if we give children all these choices and we've got 25 different children in the classroom, how is there enough time in the day to give children the ability to be able to do what they want to do, and how do you keep control of that?
Right. Again, I'm not advocating just popping open the can of worms. I think it's very critical that we're aware of the current reality of our learning environment. If in our learning environment right now that a student during the course of their day is not making any choices except for whether they eat, which part of their lunch they're eating first, I think that then in that kind of situation, then we look at creating just very small choices that are going to give the student more opportunity to express their needs and their ideas and what their needs are within the context of that learning environment. So again, even something as simple as giving them a choice of 3 different essay questions is still a choice and needs to be recognized and affirmed as an explicit choice. And then, hopefully as the structure, as the system of schools is more supportive of that kind of choice making, then the students and the teachers and the administration are going to be able to do that. And there are models already that exist.
Where are they?
Let's see. In Pennsylvania, there is a Patina school, which is a school that is an alternative school that's been, I think, in existence for 20 some odd years. I think that's
27.
One school that has really been able to create a lot of choices for their students, and it be supported by a responsible participation of teachers and parents. Again, I think that there's a wide spectrum of schools that are currently existing, including the families that homeschool. And when you look at that broad spectrum, I think all of those students' needs are going to be met by giving more opportunity for appropriate and timely choices.
It seems to me that many of the alternative schools that have been in existence that give children choices were all in the private sector. I was thinking of, there's quite a few of them in Sudbury School in Massachusetts or Connecticut, I can't remember which, where the children literally control the entire school environment. Absolutely. And there's allowances for children to even develop curriculum that they want. The teachers are themselves hired by the students. They politic when I was there the last time, there were teachers walking around, or potential teachers, who were walking around and talking to students. In order to be able to become a student for the following year, they had to make themselves known and let children know who they were, and the children, in fact, had all of the say in terms of voting the teachers in. They are considered in Sudbury a democratic school, where the students learn not only the ability to choose their own curriculum, but also to govern their own. They have not only a town meeting where the children develop all the policies and procedures, but they literally have a court where any offenders who do anything to break the rules of the school go into that court and then are tried as literally in a court of law, where there are two attorneys, quasi-attorneys, and several judges at different ages. So there are many different kinds, and that is an extreme alternative in terms of alternative, because the students, there is no standard days of attendance. Children come in and out when they choose. And I consider the Sudbury School a real extreme, and yet for the last 25 years they have producing students who from every walk of life go to colleges and universities and everywhere. So there have been schools that have existed that are reflections of the kind of philosophies that you're talking about, but I'm not sure that every parent is going to want their child to be able to, do these kinds of things.
Well, I'm really, I'm really glad you brought up the process, the democratic process that we have available as a structure for how we can go through, make choices, be accountable for our actions. I think that, I think all opportunities for a student to be engaged in that kind of process of learning, that, making a choice, being accountable to that choice, and then working with it, and creating that kind of cooperation and dialogue and expression with other students and adults, I think is really going to be a critical aspect of our success as educators, because that's where real thinking takes place. That's where real, that to me is at the core of education, being able to interact and cooperatively meet the needs of every person that's involved in a system. So.
Now, you were talking about full potential learning systems. What does full potential mean? I mean, that could mean anything.
What I'm making reference to is, again, part of the work that I've done with educational kinesiology, but again, it's focusing on the full potential of a learner, and also of a system. And so the different aspects of that potential lie in willpower, emotional potential, social potential, physical potential, mental potential, and spiritual potential. So when we look at these 6 different facets of, and again, this is a model that we can just use to look at learning and our individual needs, what invariably happens is that when we are in a position of stress or survival, one of these potentials is bound to get just put by the wayside. And at each time that we are put into a stress situation and put one of our potentials by the wayside, we basically have an unintegrated person or an unintegrated system that's doing their best to make it. And so, again, in willpower potential, which is, again, where I think a lot of the dynamics of choice come up, it's in creating win-win scenarios.
Well, we don't generally allow children to have a will, because we structure the day so that potential is not really a part of the process.
Right, and so I think it's pretty clear that there's a lot of, at least for me, a lot of the manifested issues and struggles that go on in a lot of different schools are rooted in creating situations where someone is bound to lose. It's almost like it's just a setup. And so if we can really make as one of the most fundamental principles that we are going to create a win-win situation. And there are schools that do this, and there are programs that have the opportunity to create that kind of structure. But things are different. We make choices based on the people in the room and not by some abstract principle that is governing our actions. We're making choices that come from our own centered place of intention versus trying to meet a performance standard. Things change. There's a flexibility to the structure, the process, the content that takes place. But what's critical is that we also have the responsibility to set goals and rank priorities. That we support, that we sustain our effort until we reach our goals. So there's a lot more responsibility in the part of each of the individual people as opposed to placing all of that responsibility and power outside of ourselves onto all of these different people.
You are listening to WAAT, Children Come First, 7:50 a.m. on your radio dial. This is Dr. Daria Brezinski with Carrie Girstantus. We're here every Tuesday from 10 to 11 a.m., and we're talking about children and integrated systems of learning and how we can help our children better in the curriculum and in education. Now, Carrie, I was thinking as you were speaking there about the dynamics, the organizational dynamics of the school, and I'm very familiar with public schools and have worked in public schools. Mm-hmm. We are talking about people here who have been teaching for 20 and 30 years. How do you expect them to be able to change their way of thinking? How can we assist teachers in their ways of thinking? And secondly, we're talking about throwing out standards of learning if we're talking about individualized instruction. We're talking, which is what I think you're talking about, having the student make choices in terms of their own education. In that way of thinking, we are taking away what education has today, which is what I consider the control model of the teacher standing in front of the classroom and divvying out all the information rather than the student being actively involved. How can you possibly incorporate a new model when educators have been trained in something totally different for all these years?
I think we start with the teachers themselves and give them an opportunity to, a teacher with 20-some-odd years of experience in a classroom is going to have a vast amount of experience and awareness of what has occurred day in, day out in their classrooms. And I think that if we can create, again, if it's going to be a truly win-win situation, then the teacher of 20 or 30 years tenure is going to be respected and be able to be heard for what needs to take place in the classroom. And I hear what you're saying about
well, I kind of disagree with you because the teachers that I know who are 20 and 25 years in the teaching profession are ready to retire. They're not ready to learn something different. And for the majority of the teachers, especially in the state of Pennsylvania, they're about to retire. What do we do for education with the people that are, on their way out and really not interested in doing something different and unique?
Well, if they're not interested in doing something, if it's not a win situation for a teacher who's ready to retire, then maybe there's some other position or role that they can take during this time of transition. But if we're really going to be mindful and be as our primary goal the learning and educational process of the child and the children and the students that are part of, basically that we have a certain responsibility for, then we need to employ a far more deeper relationship into our community than just the teachers that are in the classrooms day in, day out, because I think that it is an unrealistic expectation for one person to be able to facilitate the learning for however many students that cross their path during the course of the day.
Well, it's my
so we're going back to a learning center, a center of learning where students and parents and teachers and administrators all facilitate that process.
I think what I probably would consider is that what we need to have happen is for us to begin teacher training programs that are different than what we are today. We're training teachers out of a 100-year-old mentality.
Absolutely.
Of five core curriculum, which was established in 1893 by the Committee of 12, and the Carnegie Units, which is established in 1903 by the same group, where students have to learn 5 subject matters in a certain period of time. And as everyone knows, that standard was not developed in any way, shape, or form based in any kind of research. It was merely something pulled out of a hat. And here we are 100 years later, based in a core curriculum that we keep trying to motivate children towards, which has nothing to do with the latest brain-mind research, but in fact is something very ancient and archaic. And yet we have teachers who are trained in 100-year-old philosophies and theologies. So it's the place that I would consider starting is with teachers, and you have to start with administrators as well to do this rethinking process. Because if you only teach teachers and not the administrators, the principals will not know what their teachers are doing and will not understand.
Right.
So my suggestion would be to start renovating and restructuring teacher training programs for teachers to be able to think in different ways and give them opportunities to think in different ways. However, that's going to take something that taxpayers don't want to hear, and that's going to take additional funds. Money for teacher training is going to happen some other time other than during the regular school day, which is probably going to be on weekends, and how many teachers are really dedicated enough in the teaching profession to want to do something different and want to make differences and want to go to school on weekends. So we have a dilemma here in terms of trying to restructure the educational model. You were talking earlier about the death reacting syndrome in terms of the paradigm we have today in education. And I was thinking about, you talked about addictive personalities.
Right.
And I was thinking that, you know, for the most part, Americans all are addictive personalities in one respect or another. We're addicted to the television, we're addicted to drugs, we're addicted to alcohol. Look at people walking around today, they're addicted in overeating, and if they're not, they're probably addicted to exercise clubs. So what can we do? You know, how can we do something different in our classrooms when we've got a whole society of people that have addictive personalities and are death-reacting personalities rather than life-supporting?
Again, I think that any opportunity there is to bring forward, to be able to more explicitly define and become aware of our survival patterns. So again, I think of not so much as addictive personalities as addictive survival patterns, because what oftentimes happens is that when someone's not under stress, they usually don't do all the things that they do, but as stress
Most people don't get enough sleep.
What?
Most people don't get enough sleep.
Correct. So wherever it is that the stressors are originating from, they're kind of, it feeds that dynamic of not really attending to the needs that we have to support life, but we are basically just filling the urge or the need or the craving for something that, because, those addictions at one point in time helped us to survive, whatever it was. That cup of coffee helped us to survive that one morning. It becomes an addiction when we make that choice every morning, whether or not we truly want it, need it, or choose it. And when that choice element becomes to be erased or eliminated from that mental process, again, if we can become more aware of what we do and mindful in our day-to-day interactions, then we will be we'll be defining a paradigm so that we can release it and create something that will support us. So again, it's the intention in examining and looking at where we've been is in order to see what we got from it, what we don't need from it, and then to be able to create something that is going to support our needs.
I was thinking of some of the hierarchy in education, from the school board to the superintendent to the principal to the teacher, and historically there is not a lot of support going on from any of those levels filtering on down through because of the controlling model we have. It's much more, I see more superintendents doing micromanaging and reacting to situations and principals who are much more involved again in reacting to situations, and so we have more of a reactionary mentality in our schools from the hierarchy than we do, and I'm sure that that same philosophy holds true. Fruit doesn't fall far from the tree. If it's happening at the administrative level, it's going to be happening at the teaching level as well. So the idea of a life-supporting paradigm is very foreign to most in education today, unless they, again, have been in alternative schools where they understand how this life-supporting phenomena exists. One of the aspects that we do not deal with in our classrooms is emotion.
Absolutely.
Ecology, my two E's, ecology and emotion. Those are two of the extraordinary reasons why we have a lot of problems that we do today. Children are just not connected to their environment, and they're also not connected to their feelings and their emotions, and hence become bottled up and disassociated. They live in artificial air, artificial lighting, artificial food, artificial everything, artificial. It's like they, almost as if educators and students live in a bubble.
Right.
When it comes time to come out into the real world, it's a totally different place than our expectations were when we've been educated, and college is even worse. I mean, it's about the highest, college and university level is about the highest of the philosophical extreme to reality that possibly exists on this planet. Most students who go to universities don't get the opportunity to do practicums, especially if they're teachers, until their junior year.
Right.
So they really never get a chance to be able to do real world work until they're halfway through their college and university life, and God bless you if you decide that that's not where you want to be. So what I see is that there are many different kinds of changes that need to occur on many different levels in our educational system in order for it to be able to become integrated. The first and foremost is, I can't imagine superintendents, school boards, and principals sitting in a room together talking to each other about how to create, for example, a goal for the school district that's synonymous with everybody else's goals in a direction. I recently saw a goal statement. A school district here showed me their mission statement, and that was to create students that were able to function in the 21st century skills and technology. And I walked around the school district, and there was not one computer in the classroom. So, we can make all these wonderful philosophical premises, and which is what we do a lot in education, and yet in reality, things just don't happen because the system and the structure is so complicated. I liken it to a watch. If I take a watch and spread out the pieces on a table, I have individual pieces. I have arms, I have numbers, I have cogs and gears, I have a handle and things like that. When I look at those pieces, I can't even conceive of what it might look like when I put it together.
Right.
And yet when I put it together and it becomes a watch, it creates something that is much, much more than the individual pieces. It's something that's intangible, which is time, telling time, and ticking. Those are two things that I would not have conceived of had I looked at the pieces of the watch. So I consider education today something much, much bigger than the individual pieces, which are the students, the teachers, the educators. It's become so vast and so huge and so large that it has taken an entity and an energy of itself. And it's going to be extremely interesting to look at how to change that entity from within, which is where it needs to change, and create a whole new structure. Carrie, we've really had a great time today with you on our program. We'd like to thank you so much for having us.
You're welcome.
We have been talking to Carrie Girstantus here from Virginia about integrated systems of learning through all of the different systems that exist in education today, the teachers, the students, the community. And you are listening to Dr. Daria Brezinski. You can reach us at 570-639-2931 with any questions you might have. That's 570-639-2931. If you'd like to talk with us at any time. Thank you, Carrie, for joining us today.
You're welcome.
And thank you to our audience for joining us. And if you'd like to have any information about our program, you can call us again at 570-639-2931. We look forward to meeting with you next week on Children Come First. This is Dr. Daria Brezinski. Have a wonderful day.